in addition to all this, her health is getting worse. I have a good friend who's a doctor, and I asked him to diagnose her. And he said, the symptoms are too, general, too vague. I can't diagnose what she had. But she's a semi-invalid by this time. And in 1869, she and her husband, for reasons they never really explained, decide to return to England. And he was English. Later she says that it was much cheaper to live in London than in New York. And I was really surprised to read this, but it's cheaper because of an interesting arrangement they had in London. You could live in an apartment, and the people who owned the apartment would provide basically servants for you, and you would shop and they would cook the meals for you when you wanted. The only equivalent in New York was a boarding house, and you had to eat with everybody at the same time and, just be in one room. So they go to England in 1869, and they have a fair amount of money at that point, and they travel from one spa to another. They end up in the city of Bath, and she said, we hated Bath. There wasn't a single free thinker there. But they were a very gregarious, outgoing couple, and they made a lot of friends in London. And there was a fairly substantial free thought community in England in these years, partly because of Darwin, partly because the Church of England was so intransigent, and the state church. And she makes a lot of new friends. The closest were a family called the Bradlaws. Charles Bradlaugh was the leader of the English free thought movement, and he publishes a journal called the National Reformer. All these free thought journals were totally closeted in name. The American equivalent is the Boston Investigator. You would never guess it was an atheist newspaper. And he has two daughters, and they become her friends. And they meet other couples, and they have a very, vibrant social life. And she seems to recover. And in 1873, they come back to the States, and they seem to have decided to return to America for good. But unfortunately, a month after they arrive, she gets really sick. So sick that she could not sit up in bed. And they decide that they have to go back to England when she recovers. So in 1874, they go back to England, and she will never return. And she's, by then she's in her late 60s, and there are a lot of tributes written to her, how wonderful she used to be, what a great speaker she was. She speaks occasionally in these years. The two final times she speaks are in 1878, when she was 68 years old, once at a conference in London of liberal thinkers, and she's constantly saying, I cannot support religion. I know you want me to. I, agree with you in everything, but I think religion is a force for evil in the world. She always called religion superstition. But there she is, a woman speaking in public at a time when that was still very unusual, and much more unusual in England than it was in the United States. Her last public speaking is done in Paris later that year at a Society of Friends of Peace. And she and William became pacifists. They had met with pacifist groups in the United States. They meet with them in England, and this is the one in Paris. And she gets up and in French apologizes for her bad French and that she cannot speak very long. But she wants every pacifist group to have a female component, to have women to have equal voting rights within the society, and they all cheer and agree. So that's the last time she speaks publicly. They lead a private life, and in 1882, the great tragedy of her life occurs, and that's William drops dead of a heart attack on the streets of London. She was 3 years older than him, and he had always taken care of her. And her friends say, her non-free thought friends say, isn't it a shame that she doesn't believe that she will meet him in heaven? But of course she doesn't. And, her friends take care of her, and she lives another 10 years in London, and she is generally praised by, of course, the free thought papers. But she has some ugly incidents happen. Many believers thought that an atheist would convert on the deathbed. Right? What are you going to do when you know you're going to die? So a seminary student writes her a long letter about, haven't you thought about death? Aren't you going to convert before you die? I mean, you don't want to go to hell. And she writes him back and says, I have no intention of converting. And she sends him her 1851 speech. And he sends it back to her ripped in little pieces. And the Free Thought newspaper, supports her and says how ridiculous this is. And unfortunately, she outlives many of her English friends. Charles Bradlaugh dies in the late, I think in 1880. Mahatma Gandhi is at his funeral. His daughter Alice, the one she was really close to, dies of typhoid. Her friends back in America are dying. And she does arrange, Bradlaugh had 2 daughters. His older daughter was named Hypatia. Hypatia was a Greek female philosopher stoned to death by Christians. And Ernestine Rose arranges with Hypatia Bradlaugh to be with her when she's near death, so that no one can try to convert her when her mind is not her own. She goes to Bath every summer, and she takes a villa right next to a man named George Holyoake, who was a free thinker and a socialist. They're good friends. And there are 2 newspaper pieces from just before she dies, one about her in Bath, and then a reporter comes from the Women's Penny Paper, which was the only newspaper printed, edited, written, and distributed by women. And the reporter asks her for her papers, and her servant says, "We have recently destroyed them all," because she felt that no one would be interested in her life. It was a killer. And they took bags of papers. William had kept every newspaper article about her. He had scrapbooks about her, and they're gone. And the woman says, "I hope we will see you speak again." And the Bath reporter writes that she could no longer walk. She was in a wheelchair. But she used to sit by an open window and have a pile of pennies on the windowsill. And if anyone needed, beg, she would give them a penny. In the London apartment, she feeds little sparrows on her windowsill. So she kind of kept in there pitching until the end. And in 1892, she is near death. And Hypatia didn't make it in time. But fortunately, she had a very good doctor and her servant, and she is protected from anybody trying to convert her at the 11th hour. Now, she really was famous up until her death. There are a lot of obituaries, there are a lot of tributes to her, but by 1920, a Jewish newspaper in New York writes, only 1 American in 100 has heard of Ernestine Rose today. And by 1950, 1960, she's completely forgotten. Now, I was asked by a history outfit, why do I think she was forgotten? Was it that she was a Jew? Was it that she was an atheist? Was it that she was a foreigner? Or was it that she was a woman? And I really thought about this. It wasn't that she was a Jew. When she's in the United States, there are hardly any Jews in the United States. In 1860, the Jewish population of the United States was 150,000 out of 31 million. So there is mild anti-Semitism, but most people never would have met a Jewish person. Was it because she was an atheist? Well, there certainly was prejudice against atheists, but I don't think that's why she was forgotten. Thomas Paine wasn't forgotten, George Holyoake wasn't forgotten. Was it because she was a foreigner? Again, I don't think that's the reason. Many, what we would call immigrants, the United States is a nation of immigrants, and in those years of the late 19th, early 20th century, immigrants are pouring into the United States. I do think it was because she was a woman. If you read history up until about the 1970s, As Jane Austen wrote in Northanger Abbey, the men also good for nothing and hardly any women at all. You know, there's Molly Pitcher, there's Dolly Madison, but there are very, very few women. Women's history was basically invented in the 1970s. And the Boston Investigator had written in 1870 that in 100 years, Ernestine Rose will be appreciated. And I think that's just about what it took. So thank you very much. Now, I'm sure you have some questions, so we have some time. Yes?
A couple. Are there any visual images of William Rose?
No.
No, not a one.
No.
Not a portrait, not a...
No. There were portraits painted of her and William that were hung in Payne Hall in Boston, which was the building erected by the Boston Investigator for meetings. And the building doesn't exist anymore. The paintings have disappeared.
Also, were there any encounters with Karl Marx?
No.
And did she ever pass comment on Marxism?
No, she
and was
doesn't.
She involved with the labor movement in that way at all?
She meets with a group that Stanton and Anthony organized in 1869, I think, for women's union. And she says this is the first time she's addressed a union of women, and she totally believes in it, and she recommends jobs that they could go into in banking, watchmaking, jewelry, and to get men to support their cause. I have postcards here. I thought there would be books, but there aren't, and I don't have enough for everybody, but I'll pass these around.
Can I ask one more question?
I just want to say this is the only photograph of her that exists.
Wow.
We know there was a photograph of William, but it's disappeared. Sorry.
So I know you're aware of Yuri Soul's book about Ernestine Rose from...
That's what got me
from
into
the
this.
60s.
Yes.
So, given her disappearance, and partly maybe